Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Andy Smerick, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Manhattan Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today for what really promises to be a great conversation, this event that we're calling CUNY and the Future of Workforce Education. Although this discussion is going to focus primarily on New York City, it speaks directly to national trends and opportunities and concerns. And by way of context, then, America committed itself over the last couple decades to increasing high school graduation rates pretty significantly and moving as many students, young people as possible, into four-year institutions of higher education. Some people called this the College for All movement, and it had a whole lot of good reasons. These efforts succeeded in increasing college-going rates, and that included increasing the numbers of students from historically underrepresented groups getting to go to four-year institutions. All good, all good developments. The downside, however, is that we quickly realized that too many students who were enrolling in these institutions never earned a degree, meaning many of them left school saddled with a whole lot of debt and without any kind of credential at the end. Meaning their earnings would be reduced. In other cases, students did earn some sort of credential, a degree, but those degrees weren't really related to, sometimes not even necessary for the jobs, the careers that they ended up pursuing. So when you add that to other kinds of concerns about campus culture, the smaller number of students in this generation who are of college age compared to previous generations, and then a lot of survey results showing that more and more Americans have questions about the return on investment of a four-year education. When you just put all this together, there are some legitimate questions about what is the right path for many of our institutions of higher education all across America, public and private. Well, one promising path forward is to have more and better workforce training through our community colleges. By building closer relationships between these institutions of higher education and employers, these institutions have a chance to better align what students want, what programs they are providing, and what industry actually needs. Now, in New York and elsewhere, the economy has changed a great deal over the last couple decades, and it's going to continue to change in profound ways. And COVID obviously accelerated many of those changes. And in some cases, COVID presented even new challenges. So, for example, in New York City, the Big Apple suffered more job losses than just about any other big city, disproportionately so. Now, the good news at this moment is that this could be the right time to think about some policy and practice reforms. The worst of COVID, knock on wood, is behind us. We have a new mayor in New York City. We also have 36 states that are going to elect governors this coming November, and even more who are going to elect members of state legislatures. So now is the time to think about policy reforms. What are the regulatory, statutory, and then just day-to-day traditions, practices that might solve some of these problems? Now, two of our great panelists have recently finished studies on these very subjects that we're going to talk about. Tamar Jacoby, the president of Opportunity America, is going to kick things off for us and tell us about her great research, both on community colleges nationally, but also workforce development, workforce education in New York. Then Ray Domanico, my colleague, the leader of our education policy program here at the Manhattan Institute, is going to discuss his great paper on New York City's high schools and community colleges. Then we're very fortunate to have the president of CUNY's LaGuardia Community College, Kenneth, and the executive director of Building Skills New York, David Meade, discuss these kinds of issues from the perspective not just as researchers, but from the perspective of employers, the industry leaders, and the educators who are going to be providing the training. All right, so here's how we're going to use our time over the next hour. Tamar and Ray are going to give us their great presentations. Each will be about 6 to 8 minutes. Then we're going to have Kenneth and David offer initial responses for just a few minutes apiece. Then I'm going to pester them all with questions and see if I can provoke some good conversation among them. But while all this is going on, everyone watching has the opportunity to get involved and get involved early. You can use the chat feature in whatever kind of device that you're using to send questions my way whenever you want to. No need to wait until the end. I'm going to be monitoring those submissions along the way, and I will get as many into the bloodstream as I can, so everybody feels like this is a conversation not just among us, but everybody who's participating at home or in the office as well. Then at the end, I'm going to just save a few minutes so everyone has a chance to say their final piece. And then I promise that we will finish up by 2 p.m. sharp. So if everybody is good with that order of operations, tomorrow, thank you, and off to you. Tamar seems to be frozen on my screen. Ray, can you hear her?
No, she's frozen.
Okay, well, let's adapt here. Ray, would you mind, unless
Sure.
Kayla, our producer, has something else in mind, if you don't mind going ahead?
Go ahead. Yeah.
All right, great. This is Ray Domanico.
So as Andy said, I'm the Director of Education Policy here at the Manhattan Institute. I should also start my remarks by saying I am a proud graduate of City University from a long time ago, which was not thought of as the golden age of CUNY. It was in the mid-'70s, Baruch College, working class kid, first generation college in my family. But my experience at CUNY in those years really changed the trajectory of my life and put me on the road to the great career that I feel I've had, the very fulfilling career. And that is the story for much of City University today. National studies have confirmed individual campuses of the City University are doing a phenomenal job of taking working class and poor students, first generation students, and moving them up in the socioeconomic ladder. Even with the community colleges. In the community colleges, there is an award-winning program, national model, accelerated students and associates programs that is doing a great job with the students who participate in that. The report that I wrote 2 years ago prior to COVID, and I just want to emphasize that all of my data is from before COVID, talks about the interplay between the city's high school system and the community college system. And it really focuses on the students who are entering CUNY's community colleges, who are the least well prepared on average for college based on the state metric of college preparedness. All my data is descriptive. I wasn't able to track individual students, so it speaks to general trends. The first point I want to emphasize is that New York City's public high school system is very hierarchical. It's I can't think of a better term. It's actually a rather either brutish or effective sorting machine. So I arrayed the high schools in New York City. There were a couple hundred of them, from top to bottom, looking at the profile of students as they enter high school in New York City from the middle schools, from 8th grade. And we have some very, very fine high schools in the city, very famously the selective high schools, of which admission is based on students passing a single test that's designed to isolate, the highest scoring kids. And then there's also a second tier of schools, second tier of high schools that also get, A students from high school, but don't have that same level of selectivity. Those schools graduate almost all of their kids. Almost all of their kids are deemed college ready. Few of their students go on to the community colleges. They all go on to college, but typically four-year campuses of CUNY, public universities in the rest of New York State, private universities in the rest of the state, or out-of-state colleges. And then down towards the bottom of the schools, based on the 8th grade performance of these kids, you have schools, you have many high schools, which serve much poorer, lower income kids, kids who come to school with a variety of challenges, lower test scores in middle school, and lower attendance rates. In those schools, a good number of students get their high school diploma. The high school graduation rate in New York City is pretty high these days. It's 80%, but only 30 or 40% of their students are deemed college ready. And those are the schools that send more of their students to CUNY's community colleges. About 18 or 19% of their senior class goes on to the community colleges. This observation is backed up by CUNY's own data. The entering classes at CUNY Senior College have an average high school GPA. It varies by campus, but is generally in the 90s. So we can think of these as A students. The students who enter the community colleges, their high school GPAs are in the 70s. They're C students. So that's where these kids are coming from. I then looked at the community colleges and I asked the question, what type of programs are they involved in? 41% are in an Associate of Arts, AA programs. Those are generally thought to be preparatory for continuation into a 4-year degree. Associates of Science, AS, same thing, thought to be preparatory, 35%. Only 23% of this full-time students enrolled in CUNY's community graduates in 2019, the year of my data, are enrolled in Associates of Applied Science, which generally were designed to be terminal programs. And then by field of study, more than 40%, 42% of the students in full-time programs in CUNY's community colleges are in their majors in the liberal arts. Slightly less in business and accounting and things like that, and also health and related services, health and human services. Those tend to be terminal programs, but over 40% are in liberal arts, which you can't do much with unless you continue on to 4-year study. Okay. At the end of community college, the completion rates are low system-wide. There are variations within across the campuses. The accelerated students have higher rates, but the general completion rates after 2 years, 7%, 7.7%. After 3 years, 22%. And after 4 years, it drops actually to 15.7% because some students moving on to the bachelor's track. Long-term outcomes, CUNY serves a lot of students, even if they start out full-time, they end up part-time, but 10 years after entering, 17% of the students who entered associate's programs end up with an associate's degree, but 21% do end up with a bachelor's degree. So there is some of this movement from the community into the senior colleges, but it's taking place over a long period of time. My concern was, sort of the short-term results, these young people who are entering and really need to get into the job market. The final stats I have for you, a few things from CUNY's annual survey of graduates that's conducted 6 months after they graduate. And this again is referring to the associate's degree programs. 76% employment rate, 24% unemployment rate. Of those employed, though, only 29% were in a field either related or slightly related to their field of study. And 60% are earning less than $30,000 a year after graduating with an associate's degree from the CUNY colleges. So again, just to sum up, there are great things going on at CUNY. That was not the focus of my study. My focus is on what's going on with these children who enter high school behind, leave high school behind, and what type of training and what type of prospects do they have. I think perhaps we can do better. Thank you.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Ray. Tamar, welcome back.
Thank you. Apologies for the small technical glitch.
No problem.
Should I? So I have a few slides, and I think maybe the order will turn out well because Ray was talking about mostly high school. I'm talking mostly about community college. Let's go to the first slide. Next slide. So why the heck are we even talking about community colleges? Why is that important? And Andy set us up very nicely by talking about how 4-year college is not serving all American students well. The one number he didn't mention is that only about 1/3 of American adults have 4-year college degrees, right? And the point beneath that is that the economy is changing and education is more and more important. And it's actually especially important for the people at the top end, the people who need 4-year degrees, but it's and beyond, but it's also important for the people in the middle. Most entry-level middle-class jobs require training now. Think about an IT network guy or a phlebotomist. That's sort of those are the first steps toward the middle class. In the past, you could get by on the first steps toward the middle class without any post-secondary. That's not true anymore. Now, almost everybody needs some post-secondary education. And the point is that community colleges, and if the community colleges are the institution best placed to provide this education and training. When I used to, back in the day when I took airplanes, the person next to me would say, I'd say I work on job training. And they'd say, oh, you mean coding boot camps? Or maybe they would say, oh, you mean government job training? Or maybe they would say, oh, you mean apprenticeship? But look at the slide. There are hardly any students in those other three categories. There's 18,000 people in coding boot camps in all of America on a workforce of 150 million. There's 10.5 million people at community colleges. They are the institution that's standing there ready with the teachers and the facilities and often the machinery to train people to be phlebotomists and IT network guys and all those jobs that are the entries to the middle class. They have the reach and the scale, but they're not all prepared to do it. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Let's look at the next slide. So this is kind of a community college 101. And the slide will not be news to many of you, but it's just for a quick level set. Community colleges are very locally rooted. That map is just New York City. If you look at New York State, they're spread out the same way all across the state. They vary hugely in size. In New York, the smallest is about 1,000 and the biggest is about 26,000. In some other states, in Texas, they have community colleges with 80,000 students. Virginia, too, a lot of colleges, a lot of places, they're much bigger. They're open admission, which means anyone who shows up and wants to go there gets in, more or less. That's both a good thing for accessibility and for equity, but it's also a challenge for the schools, right? They have to get everybody through the programs and out the other end. Average tuition in New York State, it's about a little over $5,000. Again, some other states much cheaper. Some states it's as little as $2,000 a year, compared to what your kids or siblings are paying. And then the last point is really in some ways the most important level set. They have many missions. We'll talk more about them, but they have an academic mission and a prepare people for jobs mission and a hobby course mission. They do a lot of different things. And that's both a strength and a weakness. All in all, they're about half job focused and about half academic, preparing people to go on to four-year schools. And they're about half of the students are older than 24. So they're serving all different kinds of people with all different kinds of needs. And to me, next slide, the story of community colleges is really a story of potential on one hand and challenges on the other, right? They're the institution with the reach and scale to do what we need as a society and an economy, but they've always had this split personality. Are we a junior college preparing people to go on to four-year school, or are we a vocational school? And it's not that they have to be absolutely one or the other. There's certainly room for a mix, but that split personality has always caused challenges. Some of the most exciting innovation in higher ed in the past decade has been going on at community colleges, all about keeping up with the way the economy is changing, focusing more intentionally on the labor market and how to prepare people for the labor market. But we don't know how widespread that innovation is. And we don't know if community colleges are really going to step up in the decades to come when we obviously increasingly need them as really the premier provider of workforce training and education. That's the challenge. That's the uncertainty. That's what we're really all thinking about today. Next slide, we're digging a little deeper into the many missions and the split personality. So the community colleges that most of us know or think we know about is just the tip of the iceberg. It's about 2/3 of the students. 2/3 of the students show up, they say, I'm willing to sit here in class for 2 or 3 years. I'm willing to be basically at college. I'll take all kinds of courses, both my major, even if it's phlebotomy or preparing for an entry-level health, but I'll also take English and history and all the electives. I'm here at college. I want the full ride. I want the degree. And that's a very important mission. And as you see, some of them, about half here, are in academic programs, that 52%, and they're getting ready to go on to 4-year schools. About half are just learning a trade that they need a degree for, a 2-year degree, and then will then go to the labor market. That credit side of the college is very important, and the transfer mission to 4-year, again, is important for students who can make it. But there's signs of trouble, and that's what's happening here on the right-hand side of the slide. 77%, this is a national number, not New York, of students who show up, young students who show up for the first time at community college, want to transfer and get a bachelor's degree. Only 13% succeed. And to me, if that's your batting average, maybe you should be thinking about a different approach, right? That is not a very good batting average. Next slide is the other side of the college. This is the other 1/3 of the students. And this 1/3 are in what's called non-credit education. Now, how crazy is that? What the heck is non-credit education? That's where you go to learn only the skills you want to learn. I want to learn to be a phlebotomist. I don't have time for English and history and math and a degree and electives. I just want to learn phlebotomy. If it takes me 12 weeks, that's what I want. I want to get back to the labor market quickly. And also for employers, if I'm an employer and I show up on the credit side of the college and I say, can you teach phlebotomy? They're likely to say, come back in 2 years after we've gotten approval from all the different layers of approval we need. Whereas the non-credit side will say, when do you want the course to start and who should take it and how long should it last and what should I teach? So non-credit is this great tool. Nationwide, there's about 3.7 million students in non-credit education. That's 1/3 of all community college students, but we know very little about them because the government doesn't keep data. About 60% of them are job focused. Like that's what the machine is good for, and that's what it does when it's being used best. And look at this. This is the age of the non-credit workforce students, the people who've gone back to learn phlebotomy or IT or whatever it is. 75% of them are mid-career adults. So we have this institution that's training mid-career adults, people who lost their jobs in COVID, people who are going to lose their jobs in the future to the robots, training them in job-focused courses, but we don't even know about it and we don't fund it. This is the critical thing. This non-credit education gets no funding, basically, certainly not the job-focused part, from the state or the feds. I'm going to go quickly because I'm probably running out of time. We're going to do a little bit of how New York compares is the next slide. So what's interesting about this slide, the national averages are on the right and New York is on the left. The darker colors are the credit side of the college, right? And the sort of muted colors are the non-credit side. And what's important to notice nationally, on the national side, there's plenty of workforce education going on the credit side. So, like you might be learning phlebotomy, you can learn in 12 weeks. Veterinary tech probably takes 2 years and you need a full degree. So there's plenty of workforce education going on the credit side. That's a good thing. There's plenty of workforce education going on the non-credit side. That's a good thing. But look at New York over here on the left. Nationally, about 1/3 of the credit of the whole pie is credit workforce education. New York, it's only more like 1/4. So many fewer people learning to be vet techs, learning to be construction managers. And then non-credit is also complicated because what's this big blue swath, light sort of powdery blue swath that's non-credit but isn't workforce education. So just going to the next slide. When I showed you a slide a minute ago, we were looking at the US average, which is again here on the right. Nationally, about 60% of what goes on the non-credit side is workforce oriented. There's some people there to learn French cooking and photography. There's some people there to learn ESL. That's what those other light blue and the dark blue are. But mostly it's workforce ed, not in New York. In New York, only 40% is workforce ed. There's a lot of ESL and remedial education going on at CUNY, and actually a lot of French cooking and photography and learning to be a videographer hobby going on at SUNY schools. So I have a slide about employers, but I think I'm going to skip right to the policy slide because I want to open the way up for others on the panel. The policy slide is the last slide with a clipboard. And there's a lot on this slide, but the thing I'm going to focus on is just this last piece for the funding. Because the point is, non-credit workforce education, and we can say a lot more about it. I went through it at a breakneck speed, is one of the best tools we have for workforce training for college age kids and adults and employers and the economy because of that agility and flexibility. But there's no state funding for it. There's no institutional funding for colleges that provide it. There's no financial aid for learners who want to go to college and say, I need help. There's no Pell Grant. You can use your Pell Grant to get a sociology associate degree, which I pretty much guarantee you has zero value in the labor market by itself. But you can't use your Pell Grant to learn to be a phlebotomist, which is an entry-level middle-class job. And that just really has to change. There's a provision circulating in Congress. It's been circulating for a few years that would start to solve the problem. May or may not pass this year. I wouldn't count on it. The governor has a line in her proposed budget that would, which has a slightly better chance of passing, I would say, than what's happening in Congress. But it's also only a first step. It's some funding for some programs, in some circumstances. My paper that I've just released at the Manhattan Institute says that the mayor should step up. It would not be very expensive. The city already has a budget of $1.4 billion a year for CUNY. We could have scholarships for non-credit workforce students for about another 45 million, hardly even a rounding error. To me, it's one of the most appealing opportunities awaiting the new mayor, and it would be a small price to pay for a big boost in economic mobility and a more competitive city.
Well, thank you so much, Tamar. This is great. All right, so we're going to start with Kenneth. Kenneth, I want to give you, you're the leader of one of these institutions that we've been talking about. So I want to give you a chance to respond to really anything that you've heard so far. But the thing that really caught my eye, if I were the leader of one of these organizations, what I'd be thinking about is, I'm pulled in lots of different directions here. Some people want our institution to make sure as many people get degrees as possible, but also it's important that we have these non-degree, non-credit programs. Some people want us to make sure that we are just getting a 2-year program preparing people for the workforce, but other people say, no, we need to prepare people for 4-year institutions. Some people want us to be open enrollment to be as accessible as possible, but if we do that, then our graduation rates might be quite low. So on any given day, you could succeed on one dimension and make a whole lot of people frustrated. So how do you think about all of these different things that are pulling and pushing you in different directions while keeping an eye on, well, we want to make sure that we're graduating people who are prepared to succeed in the workforce or higher education?
Thanks, Andy. It's a great question. And let me just start by saying good afternoon to everybody out there, and a big good afternoon greeting to my fellow panelists, and a special shout out to Ray and Tamar for their studies. I think they both know this, that I have been using their research for a long time, and their studies are super helpful to someone like me on the ground, trying my best to run a CUNY community college under these interesting conditions. Andy, before I get to that question, which is big and broad and exciting, just a little background on LaGuardia for folks in the audience who may not be familiar with this college. We are one of the 7 community colleges in the CUNY system that Ray spoke of. In fact, many of our accounting students aspire to go to Baruch, where Ray went, to get their bachelor's degree and then sit for the CPA exam. Our students, as both Ray and Tamar have reminded us all, earn 60 credit associate degrees or industry certifications, and sometimes both. That's often a good formula. When they graduate, most, as Tamar indicated in her slides, most transfer to senior colleges, and most often in the CUNY system, to pursue bachelor's degree. Because again, couldn't agree more with Tamar that a standalone, if the only credential you have is a standalone 60 credit associate degree, that is not much of a credential for the New York City labor market. And so again, most of our students aspire to transfer into a senior college and complete their studies and at least get a bachelor's degree. But a good portion, about a quarter of them, will go straight away to work. And we'll come back to that later on, I think, in this discussion. Just a reminder again, community colleges, some people refer to them as 2-year colleges. Most of our students, this was in Ray's notes, but most of our students need at least 3 years to earn that degree. That's because many of them, almost half of our LaGuardia students anyway, attend part-time because they have to work to support themselves or their families. Just in terms of where we are in the pandemic, there are about 1,200 community colleges in the country. We have all been hammered in terms of enrollment during COVID. So in LaGuardia's case, we had 16,000 degree-seeking students in the fall of 2019. 2 years ago this month, we had to pivot, shut down the system, and pivot to everything going online. Today, we have the spring semester started last week. We're down to 10,000 students. So let me say that again. Here at LaGuardia, one of the larger community colleges in New York City, we went from 16,000 students to 10,000 students today. We did have 12,000 students in this past fall semester, and our aspiration is to restore our enrollment over the summer and build back up to 12,000 by the fall. But we've just been hammered, as I say, by COVID, and that's another and longer discussion. At the same time, we had about 5,000 students last year in the programs Tamar was talking about, our non-degree adult education and workforce training programs. Tamar mentioned ESL, English as a Second Language. Our enrollment there is up over 200%. We have 814 students today in various levels of English as a Second Language. And the programs that I know my friend Dave in the program this afternoon is going to talk about, our construction training programs, are fully enrolled. So when it comes to the short-term workforce training programs, our enrollment is very strong, and it's recovering much, much faster post-pandemic than our degree-seeking programs. Back on the degree side, for what it's worth, our most popular majors are nursing, criminal justice, liberal arts, business, and psychology. Again, it's that mix of both, I think, things we think of as career-oriented and other programs where you really have to pursue a baccalaureate degree in the end for those careers. We are the third largest producer of STEM majors in the entire system. Even though we're a community college, we follow City College and then the New York City College of Technology in producing STEM majors. And we do have the #1 associate degree nursing program in New York State. A lot of our students here are pursuing careers in healthcare. And finally, who are our students? They reflect the great borough of Queens. So they come from 158, I'll say that again, 158 different countries and speak close to 90 different languages. More than half were born outside the United States. So think of our students as a very, very internationally sort of diverse, first generation, foreign-born student body. If there's one sort of dominant group, it would be women who identify as Hispanic, many of whom are interested in healthcare. Again, just an overview of where we are. And on any given day, it's true, we are trying to do a lot of different things. And that is both a burden and a curse, or a blessing and a curse in community colleges. We're tasked with so much, but that's why I do the work personally. I mean, it makes it really exciting because we can be flexible. We can address problems that the four-year institutions don't address. And we provide this kind of on-ramp for people of all these different diverse educational backgrounds and needs to get on an educational pathway, to get education, skills, and training, and hopefully a job and a piece of the American dream.
Fantastic. Thank you. At some point, I'm going to want to come back to this question of, as the economy changes so much and industry needs change so much, how are you able to remain nimble enough to make sure that the offerings that you have and the faculty that you have can keep up with that? It would seem like it's just an ongoing fluid process, and often big institutions have a hard time doing that, but that's what's required if you're going to be at the cutting edge of giving employers what they want. Okay. We also have a guest, David, who is able to talk to us from the industry side. So you run this remarkable organization that tries to get different types of people who traditionally have not been able to go into these particular trades into the trades. And so you have this ability to both work with industry leaders and the individuals who want to begin these careers, and higher education institutions to sort of put all of the pieces together. So based on what you've heard so far, tell us, what are you thinking?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me here today. Really, really appreciate it. Yeah, again, Dave Meade, Director of Building Skills New York. Really quickly about us too. We are a nonprofit workforce intermediary, and we were created by leaders in the real estate industry. So you really have the backing of employers. They wanted to create an organization that could better train and place people into the construction industry. I've been with the group for 5 years. I would say, our team has worked really closely with the industry. We've built up a network of, really, I think it speaks to this today, over about 100 small businesses, electricians, plumbers, carpenters. We're on the phone with them every day. We're always trying to find out what their pain points are, what they're looking for in terms of entry-level talent. We're trying to find them the right individuals. And I think the two quick things that we did as an organization is we started operating on construction hours. So we listened to what the industry needs were. We start our recruitment events at 6:30 in the morning. On time in construction is 6:30, not 7 a.m. And we really do drill that into our candidates. Secondly, just try to work in the speed of the industry. And I was picking up on some of the different comments today. I think it's real interesting to highlight. Kenneth mentioned too the training program that we're doing with both LaGuardia and Bronx Community College. What we did is we launched a skills training program with our industry partners and with the two community colleges. It utilizes something called NCCR, which is a nationally recognized construction curriculum. And I think what's relevant to today's discussion is the role that we played building skills and in setting up what we wanted to be an effective training program for our employers. Is we just spent a lot of time with them. We were on the phone with them. We were talking to them. We were getting out to sites, really getting a sense of what it was they were looking for in a training program. And there's such a need for this. I think they came back to us with a few things. They wanted a standard, something they're familiar with, so they know as a person's coming out of the program, they have a sense of what they're going to get. Two, it teaches essential tasks. We just had a person graduate from LaGuardia in electrical, got 200 hours of deeper dive electrical training. He's coming on day one with some background in electrical code, and he's able to work with conduit, make 90-degree angle bends, et cetera. So the employer really values things like that. I think the third kind of final thing I would say, and picking up on really what I think Tamar was saying in her report too, is the regional needs. We source for employers in New York City. The New York City market in construction is so much different than construction that happens in our very rural areas. So just really, they wanted to make sure that people were learning the right things in these classes that pertain to a New York City construction site.
Great. Well, I want to begin opening this up and invite everybody to ask everybody else questions, but let me kick it off with this. And this comes from some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. And please, if you're watching this, feel free to use the chat function to send in more questions. It relates to what types of skills we need to think about first. So both Ray and Tamar, you know a whole lot about high schools, especially technical high schools. So are we talking about thinking early on about basic math and reading skills, but even interpersonal skills like grit and hard work, waking up at 6:30 and being on the job site? Or can we move past some of those things? Or are those always on our mind? And we need to start to think about the very particular technical skills for each one of these different industries. So how can we think about skills?
That's a really good question. And the way I think about it is I think about the Ford factory. You didn't have to be able to speak English in the Ford factory, right? In 1905, like immigrants did it, and you didn't have to problem solve. The thing came right by you, and all you had to do was tweak it. Today, almost every job, you need to communicate and you need to problem solve. You also need to show up on time. That's really important. The grit and the showing up on time and the being able to look the boss in the eye. But you need critical thinking and problem solving. So just teaching the person to draw the blood or to work the IT networking is not enough. You have to teach them communication and problem solving. And that's a challenge. There's a lot of challenges in this reform that we need that go to the academic side. They've got a lot of challenges, a lot of adjustments to make. But the people that are used to doing the training, the hard adjustment for them is how do I get beyond the drawing the blood or the IT networking stuff and also teach them communication, teamwork, problem solving, what are sometimes called fundamental or employability skills. So you put your finger on something very, very important. And again, there's change needed all over the system to kind of get to the modern 21st century system we need. And that's one of them.
Ray, do you have thoughts on this?
I would just add to that. I think particularly in terms of the high school years, you need to think a little bit about how you motivate these students. So as I said before, we have a lot of students who enter high school in New York City who unfortunately, when in the standard skills of reading and mathematics, they've only known failure. The state has been telling them they're not proficient since third grade, right? And so they need, I think sometimes, as Tamar said, you have to teach these skills, but I think in the context of something tangible and real, like learning how to draw blood, you might get a bit of motivation. I'm sorry, I can't remember the source, but I read a study this week from another place in which they interviewed people in all places, prison, who were getting job training. And they said, man, we wish they would have been teaching us this way when we were in high school. Maybe we wouldn't be in prison today, right? So that connection, so they can see the reality of why they're learning these things, I think is a very important point.
A variation on that theme, Kenneth, when students arrive at your school, Are you noticing, if you and your faculty are thinking, how do we prepare these people, especially young people, to take the next step to go to a four-year institution or to enter the workforce? Are you noticing particular skill deficiencies coming in that you wish that the preceding institutions had taken care of? Like, how would you talk to high schools or others about preparing them to be prepared for your institution?
I mean, yeah, we do notice that, and one of the two versions of this now as we emerge from the pandemic. One problem is, unfortunately, so many of our students have never really had exposure to sort of the experiences Dave's is talking about, or they haven't had the summer job or the internship, for example, that Tamar had when she was growing up. So they don't have world of work experience, and if they do, it might be really limited. And so one of the things when they come to LaGuardia that we want to compensate for is that, and so we do a lot of stipended internships and partnerships with nonprofits and employer city agencies to get our students out there, so that ideally in an internship with a stipend, because our students are quite poor and they can't really afford the opportunity cost of unpaid work, but you want that internship to be related to a field of study. So that's something we really need, and honestly, we need to do more and more and more of that, so they can also start to, when they're in a classroom, have a better sense of where this is taking them, because they now know people who actually do that job, or they've been in an environment in a hospital or a school or a bank where that work is real. So that's just one of the areas where we've got to do more to compensate them.
David, you can either answer that or this next question, which we're getting variations in the chat, which relates to Europe and apprenticeships. And 5 years ago, when I was working on some of these issues, it seemed like the second word out of everyone's mouth when it came to education was apprenticeships. And Europe is getting this right, that they track much earlier and they direct a much higher percentage of their young people into trades, and like they don't have a four-year college for all mentality at all. And people would say to me, well, why aren't we doing that? That seems to be a whole lot more effective. So do you want to give any thought to, Tamar's opening slides were fantastic. The very, very small percentage of our young people who are in apprenticeships compared to community colleges. It's what, 200,000 compared to
there are 500,000 in apprenticeship and 10.5 in community college.
Yeah, a factor of 20. So when people start to say the European model works better and that apprenticeships are the way to go, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, and I could use a specific example, which might be helpful too. We had a young woman who was in retail, who we ended up enrolling in one of our HVAC classes with LaGuardia. Retail wasn't for her anymore, and she was interested in a trade. And I think, from our perspective, in many ways, I think it does mirror the apprenticeship program, is we're thinking about, what a person's learning, not only in trade school, but also on the job too. And what we did with her is we put her on a job site, more in construction cleaning, which is a great way. If you've never worked on a construction site before, you get acclimated to the site, you start to work with the different trades, you start to learn what they're doing on a site. And it also gives a lot of people a sense of like, maybe this is not what I want to do, because construction is definitely not for everybody. When it's really hot, when it's really cold, sometimes you have to be out there working. She loved it. And, as a result, she was really interested in plumbing and HVAC. So we had an open slot, we put her in. And it picks up a little bit on the last theme too. She did struggle quite a bit with math in the beginning. LaGuardia has a fantastic instructor who did a lot of tutoring to get her up to a level, because there's a lot of algebra involved in construction. And some of that can be a bit much for somebody who's been out of school for a while. Long story short, she did a great job. Ended up being the valedictorian of the class. She got through it. She passed with great grades. And we placed her. Now she's been on a construction site. She's gotten good HVAC training. We placed her a couple of weeks ago with one of our HVAC employers. She's doing ductwork, piping installation. And I think, that one example from an apprenticeship perspective, she's getting on the job learning, training, and hopefully that's building into a pathway for her.
Andy, let me put in a little perspective. Apprenticeship is the gold standard. If you can afford a Maserati and you really, can make it work, you as a student, if you have 2 or 3 years to do it, and you as a company, if you have the room to invest, and if it's appropriate for the job, apprenticeship is the best. Because what it allows is really what Kenneth was describing. When you work on the job, suddenly what's going on in class is a lot more interesting, right? Like, if I had a nickel for every person who told me I was the last person in the back of the math class until I started welding, nursing, blah, 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 suddenly I know I need math. and the other way around. You learn some theory and then you put it into practice. The challenge is not every job needs 2 or 3 or 4 years of preparation, right? Phlebotomist you can learn in 8 weeks. Some on-the-job learning is a good idea, but you don't need a full-fledged apprenticeship. Not every employer can afford to set up a complicated apprenticeship program. And so it's not appropriate for every circumstance. And really the goal, I think, is to, instead of just trying to do the German model here, Swiss model here, is let's try to extract the principles that make apprenticeship as good as they are, which is the combination of work and classroom, the employer in a really tight, close relationship with the educator, so they're talking to each other and teaching the right skills. There's a lot of things we can borrow from it without necessarily turning the American post-secondary system into apprenticeship for all. Apprenticeship is great for many situations, but it's not, this is not Germany or Switzerland.
Kenneth, what do you think?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say to Dave's example, part of the problem is that woman was probably not asked when she was in 10th grade if she wanted to wrap pipes for an HVAC installer. We don't really ask the question that way, and we don't set up apprenticeships like in this country that way because, we have another view of what high school education should be all about. So I think the good news is there's a compromise here. Much of it initiated and supported by the Bloomberg administration around CTE, career and technical education, high schools, specialized high schools. Ray's written about this. And so when you have a high school that's got a theme for careers in healthcare, or one near here, we've got one for careers in film and television, 450 students, an amazing school, a short walk from my office. At least those students are making a choice about a career direction and then getting exposure and internships and technical training while they're getting American history, while they're getting civics, while they're getting English. And so I do want to say, no, we're not Switzerland, but I think we could do more with our CTE high schools and the alignment between those schools and then programs in the CUNY system straight into jobs.
Okay, well, this is a great segue. Just from my personal experience, and I've worked for state legislator, Congress, a couple different federal agencies, a state board of education, some higher education institutions. And what I have found is that on virtually any specific policy issue, there will be terrible fights. It'll be 50-50, whether you like school choice or not, what do you think about accountability or not, so forth. The one issue that it seems that you can get 80, 85, 90% of policymakers to agree on is some kind of career and technical education earlier in young people's education. So we're not just talking community college level, not just 12th grade, but 11th, 10th, 9th, at least opening the door to them. And whether you're a conservative Republican, a progressive Democrat, this seems to make sense to them. So it's remarkable to me that we've been doing the 4-year college for all, while the intuition of so many other people is no, that actually doesn't necessarily make sense. So for each of you, do you have any thoughts about how do we change either the practice or more specifically the policies to make sure that the high schools are telling kids that they're valuable paths out there? You don't have to get a 4-year degree to have honor, to have dignity. There are other ways to do this. So,
for most middle-class white people, congressmen, legislators, governors, CTE is great for other people's kids. Most people do not think that their kid, most people college educated, BA holding middle-class adults want their kids to go to a 4-year college. And it's just universally at high schools, at colleges, even the community colleges that do it best, it's kind of the redheaded stepchild. And it's a challenge to address that. Yes, we need more money for it. We need more visibility for it. We need more programs that start earlier. But there's really a challenge of what some of us call the stigma. There is a challenge of it's regarded as a lower road. And I think, that I see that changing a little bit in the 10 years I've been doing this kind of work, more recognition that career-focused educations can be beneficial, but we still have a long way to go just as a society in recognizing the value of different kinds of jobs and the values of different kinds of thinking and the values of different kinds of students learn differently. We have a long way to go that isn't going to be fixed unfortunately, by one policy lever.
Ray, what have you seen at the high school level?
I I was going to say that there are states that seem to be doing this well. They tend to be in places where the local economy, the state economy, has a lot of manufacturing. We don't have that in New York City. But Kenneth mentioned that high school on film and broadcasting. The issue there is that within walking distance of his office, there are two top flight film and television studios. Some of the biggest shows are filmed in those places. So it's a small niche, but it's very important in that community. I think what's been lacking in New York on the policymaking side at both the state and the city level, this may change with Mayor Adams, he's made indications, and also in terms of higher ed and K-12, is we need to get people who from the business community who can see what the emerging industries are and help the systems get ahead of that. I think the educators in New York have always been chasing something, and certainly COVID and all of the shutdowns of the last 2 years, our local economy is changing, right in front of our faces right now. So it's got to be, forward looking, and it's got to be people who have skin in the game to have some role in policy making or policy advice.
I do think on a hopeful note too, and again, when I first came on, Kenneth and I spoke about this a lot too, there was an experience barrier with our employers. You've got to have 2 years experience or even 6 months experience. And I think as a result of the pandemic and aging workforce, labor shortage, et cetera, there's a variety of reasons why employers are more open to young adults, particularly young adults coming out of CTEs. But I think they're also just more familiar. It goes back to the conversations. We talked to them about NCCR, which is this curriculum that they now understand, and more, I think it's gaining traction. They just see it as something that, okay, these young adults are coming out with this. They have an understanding, they have an interest. Our employers love that. When somebody wants to be an electrician or wants to be a plumber, they love that. They know that they can teach a lot of this on the job. And I think really having that credential has started to open a lot of doors. This is a conversation 5 years ago. It was forget it, but now I think our employers know this next generation of talent. There's such a need for that right now. And they are starting to look to the CTE schools for that.
Okay, we don't have too much time left. So the last big question I want to ask is related to solutions and political leaders. My experience is that great public officials, especially executives, are always looking for simple, straightforward answers, and often they get 50-page issue briefs and they can't make sense of them, and their staff is limited. So they're looking for good ideas. So if each one of you were asked by the new mayor or one of the 36 soon-to-be new governors at the end of the year, listen, what is the one thing that I can do in my state, in my city, to advance the cause of workforce training for the millions and millions of young people, or even second career or third career changers who don't want to get a 4-year degree? They just want to get some skills so they can go to the workforce. What is the one policy thing that I ought to be pursuing right now? Kenneth, do you want to go first?
Well, great to go first on this one. At the risk of putting out a money answer, it's a money answer, not necessarily new money either, but we have to make financial aid available to low-income students who are looking for non-credit workforce training programs in IT, in healthcare, in other areas where there's really pressing employer demand right now. We have here at LaGuardia and across CUNY, we have the skills training infrastructure, but we have to charge a market price and pay our instructors and cover the overhead. And those same students who most need the jobs have no cash to pay for it. And as Tamar pointed out, there is no financial aid. There's financial aid if you want to be a history major and get a baccalaureate degree, get your Pell Grant, right? But on the federal level, we need Workforce Pell, which is a portion of a Pell Grant that could be used for non-credit workforce training. Here in New York State, Governor Hochul has proposed in her executive budget a modification, this is the first time in decades, to the TAP program that would enable a small amount of the New York State Tuition Assistance Program to be allocated for industry certifications in high demand sectors of the state economy. It's a game changer. And what happens then is we could have many, many more students receive that training. Students vote with their feet. Remember what I said earlier, here at LaGuardia, we've been hammered in our degree student enrollment. Our recovery of workforce training and ESL and our non-credit programs is going much, much stronger. Students are voting with their feet because they got to get a job, pay the rent, and again, climb that economic ladder. That's the game changer we need.
That's great. Ray, thoughts?
I would just emphasize what Kenneth said about the money. You need to free up at the federal level, free up Pell Grants and a good move by the governor of New York to be doing that with our grants here. I think we have a mayor and schools chancellor in New York City who get this issue. Our new schools chancellor, David Banks, started one of these small high schools in the South Bronx 20 years ago, and he's been involved with those schools. His schools were the first in the city to be specifically for Black and brown young men. So he's been working with high school kids in some of the more challenging neighborhoods in the city, so he gets it. I think the governor is on board, but I think at the high school level too, and to a lesser extent, the college level, is the Board of Regents sets policy for K-12 education in the state, and things are getting better, but I think they have to get a little more aggressive about approving certificate programs and whatnot. It's kind of a drag at the state level.
Great. Dave?
Yeah, I would just add on to what Ray and Kenneth said. I think, for sure, having those kind of supports while a person is in occupational training program. We're covering the cost of tuition, but we found even in late last year with the holidays, it became extra difficult for some of our students to stay in classes. So, the governor, again, talked about this, but the mayor in his new report as well. The idea of having some stipends, they could be tied to performance in the training, but something that can really support somebody while they're in the training, I think is so important to their success.
So I'm going to go in a different direction. I started us with funding, and I do recommend that the Congress pass and the governor pass and the mayor chip in. But just to take us in a different direction, so we don't all say amen to each other. What Dave talked about, the certification that he's getting his trainees, which is an industry standard. NCCER happens to be the one in construction, but many industries have the industry standard certification that's different from a degree. The school doesn't give it. An employer association that knows the skills you need in that industry awards it on the basis of a test. New York is way behind in making use of industry certifications. The state should be encouraging industry certifications. The state should pay for incentives for students to earn industry certifications and colleges to offer them. And you should be able to use your industry certification to swing from the non-credit side to the credit side. You should be able to get credit. If you've learned how to be a welder and you learned it and you passed that test, you should be able to show up at college and say, now I want to be a construction manager. Give me some credit for this. Industry certifications are a technical thing that we haven't gotten much into, but Dave did mention them. The state should get behind them in a much bigger way. Many other states are behind them. New York is way behind.
Well, this is great. We have time for maybe 1 minute for each of you to say final words, and I'll just I'll let you say whatever you want. But with this guidance, keep in mind that we have a disproportionate number of people watching this who work in public policy in some way. They do advocacy on the outside. They could be staffers to members of Congress, state legislators. A governor might be watching, or people who are philanthropists who fund some of these things. So what are the things that you would leave them with? What do you want them to know about this field? Tamar, let's go in the opposite direction. You go first.
It's just really important. Again, the number that nobody did actually use 40 years ago, 2/3 of American jobs were open to people with no post-secondary education. Today, 2/3 of American jobs require some post-secondary education or training, but it's not always a bachelor's degree. This is a really important area. This isn't just your old voc ed. This isn't just, for a few backward kids at all. This is really important for American equity and social mobility and the economy of the future. And do not pigeonhole this over here as, oh, that's apprenticeship. We'll get back to that after we fix the colleges. Super important part of American life.
Great. Ray?
I would say out of adversity, opportunity. By that, I mean, Kenneth described the enrollment declines at LaGuardia. New York City public schools are down 80,000 students since the onset of COVID. Those kids are not coming back. It's closer to 150 if you go back 5 years. So, everyone is worried about this. They're worried about the learning loss. Those are real things. But also a lot of the opposition has been just people defending the status quo. The status quo is fading away before us. So that creates the opportunity for enlightened leaders to begin to do things differently, I think.
Thank you. Kenneth?
First, agree totally with what Ray just said, but just to throw out a concept we didn't spend much time on. There are an awful lot of people in New York City, something like 750,000 New Yorkers walking around the streets of New York today that actually have gone to college. They just never finished and got a degree. And we've got to find a much better way as a system to welcome those individuals back, and not necessarily to complete a degree, but to get a credential that, as Tamar points out, might be an industry certification. Because again, we have employers that recognize those, and you can climb up the ladder and just get a better job and take care of your family. It's a huge market and a huge opportunity for the CUNY system and for others. But it also takes one final thing, which is a system that awards academic credit for prior achievement, for prior learning. This is done with people leaving the military, leaving the armed forces. It's done with people who have certain on-the-job skills that can be, and there's an equivalent, a credit equivalent towards an academic degree. But these, again, status quo never wanted to recognize that. Foreign language acquisition, skills that you might have, Andy, that instead of coming to LaGuardia and saying it's going to take you 60 credits, I say it's going to take you 45, because I recognize what you've done on the job. I recognize your foreign language. I recognize your military service, and I can apply it towards a degree. That might sound far-fetched, but it's how we're going to get a whole lot of people upskilled, reskilled, and back into the economy.
Thank you. Dave, you get the final word.
Yeah, I just keep coming back to, I think with this, just make sure there is some sort of employer engagement. It's employer informed. I have just seen this in the years I've been doing this, where sometimes training programs get set up and there's either no job waiting or they're being trained on the wrong credential. So making sure that, employers are there at the forefront of this when you're setting up a program is critical.
Well, that is excellent. A great note to end on. And it is exactly 2:00. So thank you, everyone, for your smart comments and for helping us stay on time. Just as we close, I want to invite everyone who's been watching. First of all, thank you for participating. Browse the Manhattan Institute's research, subscribe to our newsletters. If you're able, consider supporting our work. We're a nonprofit, so our work depends on support from people like you. This has been terrific. Hope to see all of you again. And thanks to all of our panelists. I learned a whole lot today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.